Now, Hick's argument is a direct response to what philosophers call the evidential problem of evil. The issue here isn't just that evil exists, but rather the specific amount and types of evil that we actually observe in the world.
The argument essentially goes like this. Even if we grant that God and evil could logically coexist, the actual evidence from our world makes belief in God difficult. The sheer quantity of suffering, the extreme kinds of suffering, and its apparently random distribution, all of this together suggests that belief in a perfect God might be unreasonable.
So how does John Hick respond to this challenge? He puts forward his soul-making Theodicy, where he argues that evil isn't just something compatible with God's existence, it's actually necessary for us to achieve a greater good.
Hick's view is that creation happens in two stages. First, you have the evolutionary process that created human beings. But the second, and for him the more important stage, is what he calls soul-making. This is our personal journey of moral and spiritual growth. The key takeaway here is that, for Hick, humans are created unfinished.
Hick argues that God's intention was never to create some kind of hedonistic paradise, a world where pleasure is maximized and pain is eliminated. That kind of world, he says, would be fine for beings who are already perfect. Instead, God created a soul-making world, one with real challenges and dangers, because it's the only kind of environment suitable for unperfected beings like us to develop and grow.
And this is central to his whole idea, that real virtues can't just be given to us, they have to be developed through our own efforts. Moral and natural evils create the conditions where that development is possible. You can't develop courage without danger, or compassion without need, or forgiveness without someone doing something wrong. Hick's point is that virtues we earn through struggle are far more valuable than any that could just be handed to us at creation.
All right, so that's the basic framework. Now let's turn to the first major objection, which is all about the suffering of non-human animals.
The objection itself is quite straightforward. If suffering is supposed to be for spiritual growth and soul-making, what possible justification is there for animal suffering? Animals aren't capable of this kind of development. So from the perspective of the Theodicy, their pain seems to be completely pointless.
To understand Hick's reply, we first need to get a handle on his concept of epistemic distance. This is the idea that God deliberately maintains a kind of cognitive separation from humanity. In other words, the world isn't designed to make God's existence overwhelmingly obvious. This distance is what allows us the genuine freedom to choose to have faith.
So here's how Hick connects epistemic distance to animal suffering. He argues that a world with animals that suffer makes a purely naturalistic evolutionary explanation of existence seem plausible. This scientific worldview creates the epistemic distance. The fact that we can look at the world and see it as a self-contained natural system, without any obvious divine intervention, is precisely what makes a freely chosen faith both possible and meaningful.
The second major objection takes on something that many find much harder to justify: the sheer scale and intensity of certain kinds of suffering.
This objection really questions whether the most horrific kinds of evil, things like the Holocaust, or a devastating natural disaster, are truly necessary for soul-making. Couldn't a world with less extreme suffering still provide enough challenges to achieve the same goal?
Hick's response here is a version of a slippery slope argument. He argues that if God were to intervene and remove the very worst evils from the world, then what was previously the second worst evil would now be seen by us as the most terrible. If God kept removing the worst evil, we'd eventually end up in a world with almost no suffering, but also a world with very few opportunities for genuine moral responsibility and character development.
All right. The final major objection we'll look at concerns suffering that appears to serve no purpose at all, or in some cases even seems to work against the goal of soul-making.
This is known as the problem of dysteleological evil, suffering that seems completely pointless. Think of suffering that doesn't build character, but instead crushes a person's spirit, or suffering that occurs at the very end of someone's life with no time left for any development. These kinds of instances seem to directly contradict the purpose of soul-making.
Hick's reply here is quite counterintuitive. He argues that this kind of evil must remain a mystery to us. If we could always see the good reason behind every instance of suffering, then certain crucial virtues would become impossible to develop. Deep sympathy, for example, is a response to suffering that seems unjust, and virtues like faith and hope depend on uncertainty. So, paradoxically, for the soul-making process to fully work, the world must contain evil that appears to us to be pointless.
Now, there is one final, crucial component that underpins Hicks's entire argument. He himself admits that without it, the whole theodicy would fail.
It's an observable fact that many people die without having completed their moral and spiritual development. Many lives are cut short, and many people live in ways that don't lead to virtue. For these individuals, the soul-making process is obviously incomplete. And Hick acknowledges this problem head-on. He states very clearly that if there are any ultimately wasted lives or any sufferings that are never redeemed, then the theodicy is false. It would prove that God is either not supremely good or not all-powerful.
So his solution is that the theodicy is only logically coherent if you accept the premise of an afterlife. He argues for universal salvation, which is a state where every single person eventually completes their soul-making process. Only if this is true can all the suffering in this world be ultimately justified as part of a universal journey toward perfection.
And this leaves us with a final point for evaluation. By grounding his entire justification for evil in a belief in universal salvation after death, does Hick successfully solve the problem of evil? Or does his solution simply depend on another, unproven assumption that itself requires justification?